Scott Weidensaul is the author of more than 24 books on natural history, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist, Living on the Wind, and his latest New York Times bestseller, A World on the Wing. Scott is a contributing editor for Audubon, a columnist for Birdwatchers Digest, and writes for a variety of other publications, including Living Bird. He is a fellow of the American Ornithological Society and an active field researcher studying saw-whet owl migration for more than 2 decades, as well as winter hummingbirds, bird migration in Alaska, and the winter movement of snowy owls through Project SNOWstorm, which he co-founded. We are fortunate to have Scott speak to us tonight about birds and beans, simple ways to save migratory birds. Welcome, Scott.
Well, thanks a lot, Becky. Susan, thank you very much. Appreciate everybody coming out this evening. I really hope that we're getting to the end of the period where we have to do all this stuff virtually, because I certainly miss being in a room with a bunch of Audubon people talking about birds. But it's nice to be able to at least get together over Zoom. Susan, you are still screen sharing, and I'm not sure if that's going to be a problem when I screen share. So maybe if you can end screen sharing on your end. There we go. That's good. And now I'll do the little two-step shuffle here in a second, because it's never very smooth when we're trying to transfer from one to the other. But I'm up in New Hampshire these days, so I know some of the folks that are on the Zoom meeting this evening. You probably know me as a Pennsylvania native, but 2 years ago, my wife took a dream job with Mass Audubon, and I'm getting used to being a northern New Englander these days. So. Pennsylvania boy getting used to the fact that it's snowing in April up here in New Hampshire. But I want to talk about migratory birds tonight and what we can do to, especially things we can do in our day-to-day lives to help migratory birds, because it is that time of the year. I think all of us, after a long and probably the most unusual winter any of us have ever gone through, I think we're all pretty much dying for bird migration to get underway. So bear with me for just a second here. While we and if all is going well, Becky, can you give me a thumbs up if you see okay, Charles, thank you. You see a title slide there? That's terrific. So I've been crazy about bird. Oh, and one other thing I'm going to do. I live in the boondocks of New Hampshire now, where our Wi-Fi is iffy. So while I'm showing slides, I'm going to turn my camera off, and then I'll turn that on as soon as I finish with the slides, because otherwise I'm liable to stop in the middle of it. We don't like that. So I turn off the video, save a little bit of my Wi-Fi. So I've been nuts about migration ever since I was a kid. I grew up in the mountains of eastern Pennsylvania, close to Hawk Mountain. I cut my eye teeth watching hawks on Hawk Mountain as a 12-year-old, and in the 50 years since then, migration has really become kind of the central passion of my life. And and why not? I mean, you think about what birds do. Migration is utterly astonishing. I wrote a book about bird migration back in the 1990s called Living on the Wind. At the time, we thought that Arctic terns like this one were the world's long distance migration champ, which they are. But we thought at the time, because we had no way of tracking them, that an Arctic tern was traveling something like 22,000 to 25,000 miles a year, which is astonishing. Except that we now know, thanks to new modern tracking technology, that Arctic terns, some of them fly as much as 57,000 miles a year. Arctic terns that breed off the coast of Maine winter in the Indian Ocean. It's just an astonishing thing for a bird the size of a mourning dove to do. But that kind of migratory miracle is almost commonplace among migratory birds. I mean, if you want to talk about a migratory miracle, there's probably no better example of that than bar-tailed godwits, which, if you're not a birder, you've never heard of a godwit, and even a lot of birders haven't really heard of bar-tailed godwits. But this is a, bird about the size of a teal, large pigeon-sized bird. And bar-tailed godwits undertake the longest nonstop migration of any land bird on the planet. This is a species that breeds across most of Eurasia, but there's a population of bar-tailed godwits that breed in northern and western Alaska. And every year, all the bar-tailed godwits from Alaska gather along the shore of Bristol Bay, along the Alaskan Peninsula, and they feed. Well, feeding is a polite way of putting it. They binge eat. It's a phenomenon known as hyperphagia. These birds gather on tidal flats at the mouth of rivers like the Ickigik River. When the tide goes out, there's these enormous mud flats full of polychaete worms and small marine invertebrates. And they just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat for weeks until they more than double their weight. By the time these birds are ready to migrate, they are 55% fat. They jiggle when they walk. They feel, they're squishy when you pick them up. They feel like a water balloon. And then when they have gained as much weight as they possibly can, they no longer need their digestive system, so they get rid of it. And in a matter of a couple of days, their stomach, their intestines, their kidneys, to a lesser extent, their liver dramatically shrinks in size. Because these birds have a hard time, they weigh so much, they have a hard time getting into the air, and they're not walking where they're going. As I said, they are going to fly 7,200 miles nonstop across the widest part of the Pacific Ocean. That's Alaska up at the top of the screen there. And these birds will take off from Alaska and fly right past the Hawaiian Islands, overfly all of the islands in the South Pacific. They will fly for 7 to 11 days of nonstop, continuous, powered flight all the way across the Pacific Ocean, and will finally make landfall on the islands of New Zealand or the coast of Australia. It is an astonishing flight, and having flown all that way, burning up all the fat that they'd laid on feeding in Alaska, they land in New Zealand, regrow their guts, and start eating again. And they spend the austral summer, our winter, particularly on the North Island at the Firth of Thames, this incredibly rich tidal estuary at the north end of the North Island of New Zealand. They'll feed through November, December, January, February, but then around March, they start to undergo the same process again. They undergo hyperphagia, they start binge feeding, they balloon up in weight, their guts shrink down, and they take off. Now, they can't fly the same direction that they took when they came across the Pacific Ocean, because they were aided on that flight by tailwinds, and they'd be fighting headwinds if they were going back the way they came. So instead, in March and April, when they take off from New Zealand or Australia, they fly the other way. They fly 6,000 miles nonstop across the southern and western Pacific Ocean, all the way to the Yellow Sea between China and the Korean Peninsula. The Yellow Sea is, again, one of these places, like the coast of Alaska, like the Australian and New Zealand coasts, that is incredibly rich in marine invertebrates. The tidal flats on the Yellow Sea, that is what's left of them, because about 60% of them have been destroyed over the last couple of decades, these tidal flats are enormously rich in marine invertebrates. And they're just plain enormous. When the tide goes out at a place like Dongling, where I took this picture north of Shanghai, the tide goes out like 20 or 30 kilometers. It is an incredible, incredible marine resource. And when the tide comes back in, I should also mention, it comes in faster than a human can run. So you pay very close attention to tide charts when you're bird watching out on the mudflats of the Yellow Sea. So these birds arrive in the Yellow Sea, they regrow their guts, they feed ravenously for a couple of weeks, balloon up in weight, the whole process starts again. And then they make one final 4,000 or 5,000 mile nonstop flight from the Yellow Sea back to their breeding grounds in Australia. In all, a bar-tailed godwit is going to fly about 18,000 miles a year. It's going to be in the air for about 22 days of total flight time, averaging about 820 miles a day. This is a species that can live 25 or 30 years. So by the time a bar-tailed godwit dies, it will have flown the distance from here to the moon and most of the way back again. But you don't have to be a big burly shorebird to do amazing things in migration. One of my favorite migratory birds, one of my favorite Northwoods warblers, is the black-polled warbler. And this is a bird that, of course, this is what a male black-polled warbler looks like in the springtime, nice and easy to distinguish. In the fall, when the majority of them, the population is the highest, the majority of the birds you're going to see are going to look like that, because the adult males will have molted into a female-like plumage, and the females and the juvenile males all look so alike, so similar to bay-breasted warblers, that a lot of birders just lump them together as bay poles and don't try to distinguish them. But this is a bird that has an enormous breeding range across North America. Black-polled warblers are found in that boreal spruce zone from Newfoundland all the way across southern Canada and the northern United States up into western Alaska, and they have an extraordinary migration route. This is a tiny little bird. Black-polled warblers like 5.5 inches long. They weigh less than half an ounce. You could mail 2 of these things anywhere in the country for a first-class stamp, which I am obligated by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to point out you should not do, just in case you've got any ideas. But this tiny little bird is going to fly all the way to the Amazon and Orinoco River Basin in South America, which is in itself an extraordinary journey, but it doesn't even take the most direct route. So if you're a blackpoll warbler, like some of the ones that my colleagues and I study in Denali National Park in Central Alaska, you are first of all going to make a nonstop, well, maybe 1 or 2 stage flight from west to east across all of North America in late September and October, and until you end up along the northeastern coast, basically from about Cape May up to Nova Scotia. That's where the majority of these blackpoll warblers are going to wind up in the fall. Now, look, if I were 5.5 inches long and I had to fly to South America, there is a perfectly serviceable land bridge right down there through Central America and Panama. Well, obviously they've overshot that, but I would still be looking at Florida to Cuba to Hispaniola and down, but that's not what they do. Instead, on a night with powerful northwest winds after the passage of a cold front, sometimes tens of millions of blackpoll warblers will take off and fly out over the Western Atlantic Ocean on an 80 or 90 or 100-hour long nonstop flight. Again, no food, no water, no rest. They will beat their wings something like 4 million times as they fly from the northeastern coast of the United States to the northeastern coast of South America. And they will do this all on about as much fat as I could fit comfortably on the back of my thumb. By one calculation, if blackpoll warblers and most migratory songbirds in general, if they were burning gasoline instead of fat, they'd be getting about 720,000 miles to the gallon. And that, my friends, is fuel efficiency. But these birds are moving from one world to another. They're leaving within a very short period of time. In the case of the blackpoll warblers, a subarctic environment in southern Canada, and within a matter of a couple of days, wind up in a tropical rainforest deep in the heart of South America. And this shift from one landmass to another has real conservation consequences for birds because our human footprint is getting progressively bigger. Blackpoll warblers winter in South America, but most of our neotropical migrants, like this black-throated blue warbler, do not. They winter in a relatively narrow band from southern Mexico into northern Central America and across the large islands, the 4 large islands of the Greater Antilles. So if you think about it in terms of land area, a black-throated blue warbler's range is not particularly large compared to that of many species of North American songbirds, but we're still talking about almost 500,000 square miles on which black-throated blue warblers breed every year. All of those BT blues migrate south in the fall and winter, as I said, on 4 islands in the Caribbean, the 4 islands of the Greater Antilles, and the rim of the Gulf of Honduras in the Yucatan Peninsula and parts of northern Central America. So, think about it in terms of the importance of a single acre of wintering habitat in the tropics. The loss of a single acre of wintering habitat along the Gulf of Honduras might be the equivalent in terms of conservation impact on this species to the loss of hundreds or thousands of acres of breeding habitat up in the north. And as I said, in a matter of days, a black-throated blue warbler is going to go from the forests of central Maine, for example, where it's cohabiting with moose and white-tailed deer and wild turkeys and black bear, making its first migration south and ending up in a completely different environment within a matter of just a couple of days. And yet research has shown that, from the very first moment when that BT blue sets down in a tropical forest, its instincts are going to lead it to find the right food in the right habitat. It will respond instinctively to the alarm calls of resident tropical species that it's never heard before. At one time, scientists thought that neotropical migrants showing up for the first time in the tropics were kind of like the new kids on the block, kind of trying to fit in, squeezing in the corners. But the fact is they slip like a hand in a glove into these tropical environments, because actually most of these neotropical migrant birds originated in the tropics. Their lineage, their evolutionary lineage goes back to the tropics. And most of these groups of birds, like warblers and tyrant flycatchers, hummingbirds, orioles, tanagers, they are most diverse. They're groups of birds that are most diverse and most abundant in the tropics. These are essentially tropical birds. But as birders, one thing that we know about migratory birds is that they're in crisis. And I think most of us who've been birding for any length of time, I got my start birding back in the 1960s, we didn't need to hear the documentation that we got 2 years ago with this bombshell paper from Ken Rosenberg at Cornell and a lot of the other top ornithologists in the country documenting the fact that we've lost a third of North America's birds in the last 40 or 50 years, more than 3 billion birds that have disappeared since 1970. We've known for years, just based on what we see when we go birding every year, that there are fewer and fewer birds every year. And there's a lot of reasons for this. It depends on the group of birds we're talking about. Grassland birds, for example, like bobolinks and meadowlarks and upland sandpipers have been decimated by the loss of natural grassland habitat. For eastern forest species like wood thrush that are in serious trouble, there's a lot of reasons for that. These are birds that evolved to breed in the interiors of large, contiguous, intact, functioning forests. And we have dramatically altered the landscape, particularly in the east and the northeast over the last 200 years. We cut down that old growth forest 100 to 150 years ago. What has grown back is a very different landscape than what was there originally. We took an incredibly complex mosaic of old growth forests and thickets and regenerating beaver dams and old wildfire burns and turned it into, basically a monoculture of middle-aged trees with very little structural complexity and very little difference between, basically we've got forests of even age, 80 to 120-year-old trees and open or developed habitat and very little in between. So that structural complexity, that habitat complexity that birds need, we kind of cut that down and got rid of it. So there are problems in the breeding grounds, and of course there's also problems on the wintering grounds. I think we've only recently come to recognize how important it is for us to understand not just the generalities of where these birds go on their migration and on their wintering grounds, but the specifics, because we've discovered that for many, many species of particularly neotropical migrant songbirds, there are very strong links, what's known as migratory connectivity, between particular breeding populations and particular wintering areas. And understanding that is critical for their conservation. So just to take wood thrushes for an example, wood thrushes have a really enormous breeding range across eastern North America. But again, like a lot of neotropical migrants, like most neotropical migrants, they have a much more restricted wintering range in Mexico and for the most part, northern Central America. We've known for a long time that wood thrush numbers are declining. And back in the early 1980s, we assumed all of the problems were coming out of tropical deforestation down in Central America and Mexico. And then we got a little bit more sophisticated, and we realized that forest fragmentation and habitat alteration up here in the northern breeding grounds are probably contributing significantly to that. We haven't really until recently given a lot of thought to what kind of migratory stopover points they need along the way, or why particular regional breeding populations are faring so much better or worse than others. For example, if you look at this, this is a map of rates of population change among wood thrush populations. And basically, those areas in blue are stable or increasing in number every year, whereas those in yellow, orange, and red are, these show increasingly steep levels of decline. Well, some of this probably and almost certainly has to do with differences in habitat and how land is being managed here in North America. But it's also entirely possible that what we're seeing reflected in the breeding grounds has its genesis far, far away. And one of the ways that that scientists like Bridget Stutchberry, on whose work I'm leaning here quite a bit, and have shown this intense migratory connectivity between particular breeding grounds in the north and particular wintering areas in the south. And so this map with the pie chart shows, for example, that With thrushes from the western edge, which is, if you notice on the map there, the area where many of the populations are fairly stable, these are birds that are wintering for the most part in southern Mexico. You get down into the Yucatan Peninsula, and it's more of a mix. About a third of the birds are coming from the western breeding area. About a third of them are coming from the southeast, and about a third are coming from the central east and the northeast. And by the time you get down into Honduras and northern Nicaragua and down into parts of Panama and Costa Rica, you can see that the predominant area that these birds are coming from are the northeast and central east. The areas where wood thrushes seem to be in the steepest problem. So understanding where these birds go is important for conservation. Understanding how habitat changes in those wintering areas is critical for conservation. And not only do different populations have different wintering areas, so too do different sexes sometimes within the same species. For example, we found out in the late 1980s, early 1990s that hooded warblers and a number of other species, they segregate themselves by gender and age on the wintering ground. So for example, adult male hooded warblers with that really rich, thick monk's cowl, they're socially dominant. And so what they can do is they can take and hold territories in the best habitat. So you're going to find them in rich, lush, lowland tropical forests in Central America. Juvenile males with a somewhat less developed hood are going to be a little bit farther inland in somewhat drier habitat. Adult females, which, as you can see in that lower bird, is an adult female. She's got a bit of a cowl, but not as impressive as the male. The social hierarchy among hooded warblers is based on how much black you have in your head. So she will be able to dominate juvenile females that have no hood at all, but she won't be able to dominate a juvenile male that's got a little bit more, much less an adult male. So basically, the adult males are in the best habitat. The juvenile males are in slightly more marginal habitat. The adult females are in still more marginal habitat, and the juvenile females are bum out of luck because they're the ones that are going to get forced into the driest, most marginal, most degraded habitat. You cannot maintain a species if your juvenile females don't have a high survival rate. And so we need to preserve habitat across the gradient for species like this. It makes bird conservation in the tropics a lot more challenging, because it means we've got to save and protect and restore larger areas of habitat than we thought before. And of course, if all of these challenges weren't big enough, the biggest threat on the horizon for migratory birds is going to be climate change. And I think everybody recognizes that this is the big enchilada right now for migratory bird conservation. It's already interfering with weather systems, with wind patterns, with the seasonal timing of migration, the seasonal timing of seasons. Spring is coming earlier and earlier. The birds are not necessarily keeping pace with that with their migration. Climate change is changing the availability and abundance and timing of food resources that they need to make these hemispheric and global journeys. I mean, you put all of this together, habitat loss and habitat change and climate change and all the other issues that are facing birds, from free-running cats to window collisions to agrochemicals. It's so big and so intractable a problem that it's really easy to give yourself over to despair and just give up. And I don't want you to do that, because my point tonight is not to depress you about migratory birds. I think we all recognize there are problems out there. It's never a bad idea to confront them. One of the reasons that 3 billion bird paper, I think, was so important is that, as Pete Mara from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center said at the time, at least we know what the score is. And I will also point out that although the news from that paper was pretty grim for most groups of birds, there was some good news in that paper. The group of birds that actually rebounded dramatically over the last 40 years, when so many other groups were in trouble, were waterfowl and water birds, marsh birds like herons and egrets and ibis. Their numbers have rebounded dramatically in the last 40 years. And the reason for that is, in the last 40 years, we as a society put a huge amount of money and time and political will into protecting and restoring wetland habitats. So grassland birds are in really bad shape. We can do the same thing for grassland birds. And I can guarantee you that grassland birds will bounce back to the same degree that wetland birds do if we put the same amount of time and trouble and money and political will into restoring grassland habitats. But like I said, these are all big problems. They can seem to be too much to bite off at once. So what I want to do tonight is talk about what all of us can do in our daily lives to help migratory birds. And, I'm not talking here about, ditching modern life and moving to the woods and living in a bark shelter and eating twigs. It's if that's how you want to save migratory birds, go for it. But most of us can't do that, nor should we have to. So simple things that we can do to help migratory birds. One is landscape with nature in mind. And what I mean by that is whether you have a tiny little postage stamp yard in town or a bigger property out in the country, I want you to focus on, to the extent that you possibly can, using native species. These are just random pictures from our backyard in Pennsylvania before we moved up here to New Hampshire, where I've been planting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of species of wildflowers and shrubs since we got here. You're not sacrificing anything in terms of beauty. And, these native wildflowers, native shrubs, native ferns, they're pre-adapted to the climate. They're pre-adapted to the local pests and diseases and pathogens. They're pretty much bulletproof. And when you start landscaping with nature and landscaping with native plants, rather than going to the garden center and buying stuff that doesn't belong here from distant parts of the world, that has no ecological connection to, to your part of New York State, what you're doing is you're binding up broken ecological connections. You're creating an oasis for birds in your backyard. And again, it doesn't have to be a lot. The late Sarah Stein, whose book Noah's Garden was a really, I think for many people, kind of a revelatory book on the importance of the ecological importance of gardening with native species. Sarah Stein made the point in that book that if every homeowner, if every property owner in America planted one native berry producing shrub, a native viburnum, a native dogwood, a spice bush, something like that, we could create millions of acres of bird habitat. And every backyard is a life raft for some migratory bird. You may not be a national wildlife refuge in your backyard with tens of thousands of individual birds coming through, but I guarantee you, almost no matter where you are, some migratory birds use your property every year on their migration. You may not even be aware of it. And it also, gardening with native species changes your outlook on, for example, insects. They're not pests anymore. They're bird food. I mean, the number of insects that migratory birds need in order to survive is incredible. Doug Tallamy, who's another person, if you're at all interested in this, Doug's books like Inviting Nature Home are roadmaps for how you can bring native plants into your life, how you can turn your property into an oasis for birds. Doug's made the point that a single pair of black-capped chickadees, they need 6,000 caterpillars every year to raise one brood of 4 chicks. And so planting native plants, planting an oak tree, Doug's made the point that there are 400 plus species of caterpillars that feed on oak trees in the Northeast. It's one of the most important things you can do for birds is simply plant an oak tree on your property if you have the room for it. I mentioned native berry producing and fruiting shrubs like native dogwoods and viburnums. I've had people complain to me, well, I planted that dogwood you told me about, and the berries didn't last 10 minutes. They were, if you want to plant a shrub for winter color, these are not the plants to plant. You want to plant these because the berries are going to ripen in late summer and early fall. And my complainant was right. Gray catbirds, rose-breasted grosbeaks, wood thrushes, Swainson's thrushes, they are going to strip the berries off them about 30 seconds after they're ripe, because these berries are incredibly rich in lipids. They're incredibly rich in the kind of fats that these birds need to migrate to Central America, to South America, across, the Gulf of Mexico, across the Caribbean. And gardening with nature, landscaping with nature is permission to be a messy gardener. It's permission to be a lazy gardener, because at the end of the growing season, just leave that stuff there, because those seed heads are bird food. The goldfinches, the sparrows, they're gonna pick through that stuff. When the green stuff starts to come up in the springtime, that's when I finally clean my garden out. But until then, it's just all bird cover. So if you're going to landscape with nature in mind, if you want to turn your property into a bird oasis, please be organic about it. You don't want to attract birds to your backyard and lure them into a chemical trap. And frankly, if you're gardening with native plants, you don't really need those chemicals. They don't need fertilizers. They don't need insecticides. They don't need fungicides or herbicides. You know, they can manage entirely on their own. So be organic in your backyard. And I would urge you to buy organic when you go to the grocery store. A couple of years ago, a research team at Stanford University came out with a paper that got a lot of attention, where they had analyzed organic and conventionally raised produce in the grocery store, and it concluded that the organic produce was no more nutritious than the conventionally produced chemically based stuff. And I thought, way to miss the point, guys. Regardless of what the nutritional value to us is, you know, organic production is much better for the environment and way better for birds. A remarkable number of migratory birds spend significant parts of their annual cycle in migration or in the wintering grounds in agricultural landscapes. And so, avoiding exposing them to agrochemicals is better for them. It's better for people, including the people who, you know, frequently have no choice but to work in a chemically soaked landscape. So yes, it costs more money, and you know, maybe it's not dramatically more nutritious for us on the consumer end than conventional, but it is way better for the planet. Here's another, what should be really simple one. If you have a cat, please keep it inside. And I say this as somebody who has owned many cats over the years, none of which ever went outside. But cats are, by a significant stretch, the single biggest cause, human-related cause, of bird death in North America. The Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center a few years ago, Pete Marin and his colleagues calculated that free-running cats, both feral cats and free-running house pets, kill between 2 and 4 billion with a B birds just in the United States. That did not include Canadian cats, every year. That makes them a bigger cause of bird mortality than windows, than wind turbines, than communication towers, than cars. And it should be the easiest thing for us to control. Keeping the cat indoors is not only better for the bird, it's way better for the cat. They're not going to end up as a furry pancake on the highway. They're not going to get eaten by coyotes or great horned owls. They're not going to contract feline leukemia. I mean, this really, as I said, you know, this ought to be the low-hanging fruit for bird conservation at a time when birds are in crisis. Okay, this one's going to seem strangely specific because, you know, we're all good conservationists here. I'm sure we all recycle as much as we can. We seek out recycled products whenever we can. The reason I want you to use recycled paper specifically and make a particular effort for that is the fact that here in the United States, almost all of the paper products we use, that paper comes out of the boreal forest of Canada, which is the largest intact forest left on the planet. 1.5 billion acres stretching from Newfoundland to Alaska. It's bigger than the Congo, it's bigger than the Amazon, and we are cutting it down for toilet paper and facial tissue, which is not the highest and best use of the world's last great old growth forest. And from a bird perspective, what makes this important is the fact that the Canadian boreal forest is a bird factory of global significance. About 220 species of migratory birds come out of the boreal forest every year, from common loons to pectoral sandpipers to savanna sparrows to Cape May warblers to surf scoters to whooping cranes. The list just goes on and on. Fortunately, we can do two things here. One is by buying recycled products, we can reduce the amount of old growth spruce that's being cut in the forest for paper pulp. We can also thank our Canadian colleagues because Canada has taken dramatic strides in recent years toward preserving huge areas of the boreal forest and setting them aside for conservation. And a lot of this is being driven by Indigenous First Nation communities across the Canadian boreal forest. I mean, they are setting aside, in some cases, you know, millions of acres of ancestral land in protected conservation land. We actually have an opportunity in the boreal forest of Canada to do something that we've never done anywhere else in the world for conservation, which is to get ahead of the development curve. I mean, usually what we do as a society globally is we develop the heck out of a landscape, and then we scramble around at the end to try to, save the last remaining pieces and protect them and preserve them. And what's being done in Canada, in Ontario, in parts of Quebec, in the Northwest Territories, and elsewhere, is that where we still have this enormous landscape that is largely untouched, gigantic sections of it, like, in combination, the size of the state of Texas in some cases, are being set aside in permanent conservation, among which, in this great matrix of conservation, among which small areas of sustainable development are being mapped out and planned. And as I said, a lot of this is being driven by a coalition of Indigenous First Nations communities, Canadian conservation organizations, actually some of the largest extractive industries in Canada, who are looking for some stability and predictability in their ability to start to develop some of the natural resources in the Canadian boreal forest. So a huge win for conservation up north of the border, which, because it took place in Canada, most Americans are pretty much completely clueless about. And so the last thing I would like you to do in order to save migratory birds is to drink more. And I want to specify there, I am talking about drinking more coffee. At least some of the birders I hang out with, I have to be specific about how much, what I want them to drink. And, I realize with DOAS members, this may not come as a surprise, because I think you guys are a little bit more sophisticated about the connection between coffee and birds than most people. But a lot of people would find that junction puzzling. It's not an intuitive link between coffee and birds. And yet, if I show you these three pictures, and I ask you to pick out the crops under cultivation here, well, obviously it's that picture where everything's planted in nice, neat rows. But the thing is, all three of these are pictures of coffee under cultivation. The difference is the other two are pictures of how we traditionally raised coffee, time out of mind, in Latin America and the Caribbean, what's known as traditional or rustic shade coffee cultivation, where a farmer would go into an existing, functioning, intact, biodiverse, rich tropical forest and plant widely scattered coffee shrubs in the shade of the forest, where the coffee ripens slowly and develops complexities of flavor and aroma. That's the way we have traditionally raised coffee in Latin America. And traditional shade coffee plantations are superb migratory bird habitat. And in fact, I've heard it argued that they are perhaps the least damaging agricultural system in the world in terms of preserving biodiversity. A traditional shade coffee plantation is only a couple of percentage points off in terms of bird or butterfly or orchid diversity from a completely intact tropical forest. It's the agrochemical, or excuse me, the agroforestry system that probably the lightest footprint anywhere in the world. Hundreds of species of neotropical migrants, especially songbirds, use traditional shade coffee farms either in their migration or on their wintering grounds, and scores of them, mostly migrant songbirds, depend heavily on such farms. For example, Tennessee warblers have been nicknamed coffee warblers by tropical ornithologists, not because they're eating coffee. I mean, my God, the idea of a caffeinated warbler is like almost terrifying to contemplate. I think they probably spontaneously combust. No, what these birds are doing, they're not eating coffee beans. They're using the habitat. They're using the insects and the nectar and the fruit that these farms provide, because there's such a rich diversity of other plants and other animals there. And the birds, in turn, are providing up to thousands of dollars per acre in pest control services, and doing it for free. And that's particularly important with pests like coffee borers, which in less traditional, more chemically dependent sun coffee plantations, the farmers are spraying a lot of chemicals to try to prevent. It's also worth noting that shade coffee farms are also significant refuges for a lot of resident tropical species, from birds all the way down through all other taxa. Although I have to say, in fairness, many of these resident species show greater sensitivity to disturbance than do migrants. So Even though there's not a big impact on overall biodiversity in shade coffee farms, there are some species of birds and other animals that can't tolerate any disturbance at all. But if you're going to have an agricultural landscape for biodiversity, this is the one. So you have shade coffee plantations that provide critical habitat to millions and millions of migratory birds, but it's a habitat that's disappearing rapidly. In recent decades, probably about 40 to 45% of shade coffee acreage in Latin America has been replaced with sun-tolerant varieties. Basically, what they do is they go in and they take what had been this rich, diverse, functioning ecosystem and bulldoze it and plant a monoculture of coffee, which produces higher yields, although it's pretty crummy coffee, but it requires enormous amounts of fertilizer and chemical, and it renders what had been high-quality bird habitat into, basically a desert. So this produces, well, I was going to say cheap coffee, but there's no such thing as truly cheap coffee. The price is paid by the birds in the enormous loss in bird habitat. And we're the ones driving this. Americans drink about a third of the world's coffee. So the decisions we make at the marketplace are the ones that are driving this conversion, because we Americans like inexpensive coffee. We like cheap coffee. Okay, so the bad news is we drink a third of the world's coffee and we're driving this. The good news is we drink a third of the world's coffee. So if by making the wrong choice, we can directly hurt birds and bird habitat, by making the right choice, we can make a huge difference for birds. And also, as you're going to hear, for people, because the people who are raising traditional shade coffee tend to be small family-owned coffee producers rather than big multinational corporations. So the first thing to understand here is that all shade coffee is not created equal. There's lots of, the devil is in the details when it comes down to shade coffee. So for example, a traditional rustic shade coffee farm has this wide diversity of native canopy and understory species. There's a lot of complexity. There's different layers of understory, different layers in the canopy, lots of epiphytes like orchids and bromeliads, and really high diversity of birds and other organisms. A lot of the coffee that is sold as shade coffee, however, does not come from this kind of a traditional rustic shade production system. It comes from what's known as technified shade or partial shade. And basically, to get partial shade, what you do is you bulldoze the hillside, you clear the forest, you plant a monoculture of coffee, and then you plant a few widely scattered, often non-native species like eucalyptus trees. Technified shade may sound good, but it's basically a monoculture. And like for example, if you look at the photo on a Starbucks bag of shade coffee, what you're going to see is a picture of a technified shade plantation on there. But even technified shade is better than sun-grown coffee, which is how an increasing percentage of the world's coffee supply is grown. Sun production is basically a parking lot as far as the birds are concerned. To give you an idea of how bird diversity varies from one of these systems to the next, this is based on some research that the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, SNBC, did recently in Peru. They looked at the number of bird species that were found in sun-grown coffee, partial shade or technified shade, and a full certified bird-friendly shade coffee plantation. You can see there are about 61 species in sun, 79 in partial shade, so a little better but not great. 243 species of birds in a traditional rustic shade plantation. So almost a better than fourfold increase in the number of bird species from sun to full shade. So that's why the scientists at the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center about 30 years ago came up with their bird-friendly certification program. There are a bunch of shade coffee certification programs out there. Some of them are not worth the paper they're printed on, quite frankly. The bird-friendly certification system from Smithsonian is the gold standard. I used to talk about about Rainforest Alliance's certification program, which was several steps down from bird friendly. It was kind of it was a good entry level certification program for farmers that were just getting, like, kind of transitioning from chemicals to bird friendly. For one thing, bird friendly requires full USDA organic certification, which can be a challenge. Unfortunately, I'm disappointed to have to say that Rainforest Alliance has so watered down its certification criteria now that it is basically useless as a certification program. If you want to make a difference for birds, what I urge you to do is look for coffee with the bird-friendly logo on it. And Smithsonian is increasingly certifying other things like shade coffee, or excuse me, shade cacao for chocolate. One of the reasons that the Smithsonian system is so good, well, for one thing, the criteria are incredibly rigorous and frankly difficult for a lot of farms to meet right off the bat. As I said, it requires USDA organic certification just right off, right out of the starting gate. And it also requires independent third-party certification, a certification process. So, the Smithsonian is not making any money off the certification program. I think one of the reasons that some of these other certification programs have allowed themselves to be watered down is because the organization that is doing the certification makes money from the certification itself. That's a conflict of interest, and the Smithsonian very wisely has avoided that. So you know when you get a bag of bird-friendly certified coffee that it is, it has been double checked that the farm is for sure following these really stringent certification requirements. It's by far the most rigorous, and there is a raft of peer-reviewed science out there backing this up. It has the SMBC bird-friendly coffee comes from farms that have the highest biodiversity among any kind of coffee system. You can see there in the graph that heavy shade, the traditional rustic form that Smithsonian is certifying, 92% of the biodiversity that you find in intact, untouched, pristine rainforest. Just to give you an example, this is what a bird-friendly landscape looks like. This is a picture I took in the highlands of northern Nicaragua, very close to the Honduras border a couple of years ago. Everything you see in that picture to the horizon is a Smithsonian certified bird-friendly coffee farm. Again, this does not look like your typical agricultural landscape. And I can tell you from more than 30 years of birding in Latin America, I have never seen both the numbers and diversity of neotropical migrants as I did in that part of the world. This particular area, as I said, it's close to the Honduran border in northern Nicaragua, close to a small town called San Juan del Rio Coco. And this is a kind of a one industry area. I mean, in that part of Nicaragua, the economic engine is coffee. They take their coffee very, very seriously there. There is a cooperative of about 400 family-owned farms that work out of San Juan del Rio Coco. All 400 of those farms are USDA organic certified. All 400 of those farms are bird-friendly certified. And the money that they get, the premium price that the farmers get for producing this extremely good, extremely high quality coffee, it does a couple of things. For one thing, it's supporting the family farms themselves. It's preventing them from feeling like they need to sell out to multinational corporations that are going to come in there and render this highly biodiverse area into a monoculture of sun-grown coffee. And I want to say that it's a richly diverse ecosystem, not just for birds, but it's a richly diverse ecosystem for the farmers. For example, a traditional rustic shade plantation gives the farmer an opportunity to raise a lot more than just coffee. For example, you can, in the shade of the forest, you can also raise cacao. Senor Vega there has a cacao pod in his hand from which chocolate is going to be made. You have to prune coffee shrubs on a regular basis. That produces firewood for the family farm, and increasingly it produces wood that European furniture makers are using because it's got a really cool twisted grain to it. You can raise vanilla orchids in the shade of the tree, actually growing up the side of the tree. Senor Vega was plying my wife. I was getting a little bit it's starting to give him the hairy eyeball, because he was plying my wife with all these beautiful exotic flowers that he raises on his shade coffee farm for the international cut flower trade. So it provides a diversity of income streams to these farmers, much more than they would get from just coffee. And also, by providing this premium price, bird-friendly certification allows small producers not just to preserve bird habitat, but to create new bird habitat. And actually, I was really shocked. I was back in San Juan del Rio Coco a couple of years ago after an absence of several years, and was stunned to find how many of the places that I had seen in years past that were denuded were revegetating. I mean, and this is really important when you look at this area from space. When you look at how much of the rest of Nicaragua has been turned into cattle pasture or grain fields, the highlands around San Juan del Rio Coco are this oasis for birds. Maintaining and expanding that oasis is going to be incredibly important if we're going to maintain and eventually restore migratory bird populations. And because the farmers in the San Juan del Rio Coco cooperative and other cooperatives throughout a part of Central America, because they're able to get this premium price for their coffee, they are buying up or leasing formerly degraded, denuded, old cattle pastures and grain fields and deforested land, and replanting it with native species. The co-op in San Juan del Rio Coco has their own native tree nursery. They're planting hundreds of thousands of young trees. In 15 years, given how fast things grow in the tropics, what had been an old cattle pasture can become a Smithsonian certified bird-friendly landscape for additional coffee production, but also additional bird habitat. It's one of the few parts of that part of the world where we're actually turning the table and increasing the amount of bird habitat. I could argue, and I often do actually, that promoting certified shade coffee, Smithsonian certified shade coffee, getting birders to drink this, getting other people to drink this is perhaps the single most effective tool that we have for preserving neotropical migrant songbirds. I mean, if only Americans would drink the right coffee. Right now, certified shade is a tiny fraction of the American coffee market, about 34 million tons a year. So it's not small beans, but well, it is small beans compared to how much coffee Americans drink. There is an enormous opportunity here to grow this share of the market and make the kind of turnaround that I've seen in northern Nicaragua on the landscape for birds to make that possible much more widely. I love this quote from my friend Bridget Stutchberry. I mentioned Bridget's research earlier. She wrote a wonderful book called Silence of the Songbirds a few years ago, where she talks about, how in the swirling steam of your coffee cup are the ghosts of warblers and thrushes. And, if you're buying uncertified cheap coffee, it's literally the ghosts of warblers and thrushes that used to use that habitat before it became a sun coffee plantation. My good friend Ken Kaufman, with whom I have taught for many years and who's been a real advocate for shade coffee for many, many years, simply asked the question, why aren't birders specifically asking for bird-friendly coffee? It's no more expensive than any other premium coffee. Now, if you buy your coffee in a can at the grocery store, yeah, this stuff is more expensive, but it's much, much better. And if you buy any kind of specialty coffee, it's rarely more expensive than that. Just because the coffee you buy is organic does not mean it's shade, that it's traditional shade grown. Just because the coffee you buy is listed as fair trade does not mean it is shade grown. In fact, chances are neither of them are. You need to look for that bird-friendly certification. It's not hard to find. Go on the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center's website. You can plug in your zip code. It'll tell you the nearest retailer. It's got a list of online suppliers, or you can buy through your local Audubon chapter, as DOAS does through Birds and Beans, and get copies. I can tell you from personal on the ground experience, it makes a huge difference for migratory birds. Look, if you're going to drink coffee, you're going to drink coffee. So why not make a little bit of an extra effort and buy the coffee that's going to help birds rather than the coffee that's going to destroy their habitat? Because after all, aren't the birds worth it? So folks, I want to thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you. I'll bring my video back on and stop sharing. And I'm going to take a drink real fast because that's a lot of talking. And Susan, Becky, Charlie.
There's actually been a few questions, Scott. First one goes back to when you were talking about the long distance migrators. One person asked, how do they sleep?
Funny you should mention that. There has been an explosion in our understanding of the physiology of migratory birds. And I'm just going to make a shameless plug here. I wrote about this a lot in my new book, A World on the Wing, about what, in part about what we've learned about the physiology of migration. So here's what birds do. They undergo something called unihemispheric sleep, where they basically put half their brain and the attendant eye, which is in the other hemisphere of the head, to sleep, alternating back and forth a couple of seconds at a time. And they can do this for months. I mean, wow. Because one of the things that we've discovered is that there are some migratory birds that during their entire migration and wintering period never set foot on the ground. Alpine swifts, common swifts in Europe, spend up to 10 months in continuous flight after they leave Europe. So you can imagine how sleep deprived they would be after 10 months if they didn't have some way of resting their brain. So whether it's a bar-tailed godwit flying across the Pacific, or a blackpoll warbler flying across the Western Atlantic, or an alpine swift, flying endlessly through the skies of Africa during the wintering season, they're just constantly putting their brain to sleep half at a time. And not only do they not get sleep deprived, their reaction time and their reaction accuracy actually increase. I mean, I study owls. I get sleep deprived a lot in the fall. I would like that pill, please, that allows me to not be sleep deprived.
Thank you. Another person asked, are there animals like our deer that threaten the vegetation in the bird-friendly coffee lands, or does the flora and fauna sort of be in perfect balance? Do you know? Well,
the short answer is I am unaware of anything quite like white-tailed deer down there. They have white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are found all the way down into South America. But in many of these areas, actually, there are still jaguars, and there are other predators. And there's also, I have to say, a fair bit of hunting, a lot more than might otherwise be the case. So no, I've never seen any indication of over browsing or anything like that down
there. Someone wanted to ask, can you buy this Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee at the grocery store? I typed back that I didn't know, but certainly DOAS sells it.
Yeah.
She also pointed out that you can get it on Amazon, but of course, why would you get it on Amazon when DOAS sells it?
That's for sure. I mean, to answer the question, just in case anybody's wondering, you can get some bird-friendly coffee in some stores. For example, Whole Foods, one of their Allegra roasts is a bird-friendly roast. So just so everybody understands, bird-friendly coffee is a certification. It's sold by many different roasters. It's sold by many different retailers. DOAS has a partnership with Birds and Beans, but like out west, Cafe Ibis sells it. Fred Meyer grocery stores across much of the Western United States have a bird-friendly roast. So there's a lot of ways to get it. It's not hard to get, really isn't.
Another question that was asked is, how do we keep bird-friendly grassland habitat open on the macro level in the Northeast, given the ongoing secession back to forests?
Well, that's a really good question. And, of course, that's one of the things that I think bird conservationists in general kind of wrestle with, the fact that, many of the grassland birds that we kind of mourn their passing. I mean, when I grew up in farmland and ridges of Eastern Pennsylvania, and meadowlarks were the soundtrack of my summer. And, you don't hear a lot of meadowlarks anymore. 400 years ago, there would not have been a whole lot of meadowlarks in that part of the world. There would have been some, because there certainly was grassland. But what has happened, because, the area of North America that had been particularly the part of Eastern North America that was the center of abundance for Henslow sparrows and grasshopper sparrows and upland sandpipers and birds like that, were the tall grass prairies from Ohio, out into Indiana and Ohio and places like that, or Iowa rather, places like that. Of course, that's just become corn and soybeans. Henslow sparrows, one of the most important areas for them now are reclaimed strip mines in Western Pennsylvania, a place where they probably never occurred naturally. So, we're constantly balancing the fact that, yes, the Northeast, land in the Northeast wants to be woods. And, with time and no human intervention, it's going to revert into forest. But if we're going to keep these birds afloat, we're going to have to do active management. I think one of the most important things that we can do is conservation organizations and wildlife agencies, we need to be working with farmers to make it worth the while of farmers to, in some cases, simply to delay their mowing. And I understand that, if you're a dairy farmer and you delay mowing your hay fields by even just a couple of weeks in order to let the bobolinks or the meadowlarks get off a brood of young, the protein content in the hay you harvest is not as high. It's not going to be as nutritious for your cows. So those farmers are taking, some degree of financial loss. We pay farmers not to plow wetlands. Maybe we should think about paying farmers either not to harvest or to delay the harvest on their grasslands. There's no reason why we can't have both. Once the bobolinks and the meadowlarks and the upland sandpipers have fledged their young, mowing is not nearly as calamitous as it is just a few weeks earlier in that process. And I've worked with land trusts up in Maine, where we've been trying to preserve some of the bobolink habitat that we take groups from the Hog Island Audubon Camp to every year. And it's been a case of getting the farmers to accept a little bit of loss. We've compensated them to a degree for their loss and delaying their mowing, and it's been a win-win for the farmers and the birds.
Thank you. Another person, to go back to the long distance migrators, asks, how high is the mortality rate for the godwit across the Pacific?
Remarkably low, surprisingly enough. Now, of course, young birds on their first migration probably have a significant mortality rate. But once they make that migration the first time, once they're adults, their year-to-year survival rate is extremely high. And the same goes, we talked about bar-tailed godwits going from Alaska to New Zealand. The Hudsonian godwits that winter in Southern South America are only just slightly less amazing. They're going to fly 6,000 miles, 6 to 8,000 miles nonstop from Southern South America out over the Pacific Ocean, kind of cross the Galapagos, cross Central America, across the Gulf of Mexico and up, and finally stop when they get to like Nebraska. And then from there, they kind of split, and some of them go to the Central Canadian Arctic, some of them go to Alaska. But there again, the adult godwits have a remarkably high year-to-year survival rate. But the fact is that for most migratory birds, we don't really have a good notion of what their mortality rates are during migration and where the real danger points are. Migration has been the black box of understanding the annual cycle of birds. And that's why we know birds are in crisis. We know that migration is the most dangerous part of their cycle. We don't know where in that migration, on those migration routes, where the greatest dangers are. We need that information. And until recently, most migratory birds have been way too small to put any kind of tracking device on. But we've had this revolution in highly miniaturized tracking devices, like little tiny nano tags that are tracked through the Modus wildlife tracking system. These things are small enough we can put them on hummingbirds. We can put them on migratory butterflies. And so we are finally starting to get a sense, maybe just in the nick of time, of where these birds are going and where the choke points are, where the danger points are, where we could most effectively be putting our relatively limited conservation money. One of the things that came out of that 3 billion birds lost paper 2 years ago is an effort being led by the same people who wrote that paper, Ken Rosenberg, Pete Mayer, a lot of other folks, called The Road to Recovery, R2R. There have been 2 major conferences online, like everything is these days, within the last year to try to figure out what information do we need? How can we get it quickly? And how can we start to apply that as rapidly as possible to reversing the decline in these birds and restoring these bird populations? And if you're interested, Google Road to Recovery. Both of those conferences, all of the virtual presentations and discussions were recorded, and you can watch them for free. I mean, it's a couple of days worth of presentations for each one. But if you're seriously interested in migratory bird conservation and the amazing strides that we're making on this, I would highly recommend you get a chance to at least dip your toe into it.
Thanks. Another person is asking what happened to the evening grosbeaks, and just sort of in general, can you say, are they related to migration problems or other birds like that?
So evening grosbeaks are interesting. You know, like I said, I grew up birding in the 60s and 70s, and like many of us, I remember the glory days when every 2-3 years, every other year, it seemed like, you'd have 40 grosbeaks at your feeder, and people were complaining about how much money they were spending on seed. I had a friend who used to refer to them as gross pigs, and what we wouldn't give for that today. So here's what happened with grosbeaks. Evening grosbeaks are not widely recognized, but they are spruce budworm specialists, just like Cape May warblers and Tennessee warblers and a bunch of these boreal warblers that feed their chicks on the caterpillars of spruce budworms, which rise and fall in these extremely long, like 30 to 50 year population cycles. In the 60s and 70s and early 80s, the spruce budworm numbers across eastern Canada and New England were high. We had a peak in the spruce budworm cycle that had started several decades earlier, and then it dropped off. And the numbers of spruce budworm warblers dropped quite a bit, and the numbers of evening grosbeaks dropped quite a bit. Well, you know what's happening now in the forests of Canada? We are entering another increase in the spruce budworm cycle, which is why we've been seeing a lot more Cape May warblers, for example, in the fall. We're seeing a lot more Tennessee warblers, and we're starting to see more evening grosbeaks. The last couple of years, evening grosbeak numbers have been increasing significantly in the Northeast. And if I don't like to make predictions about birds because they have a way of blowing up in your face, but I'm going to make a prediction that in the next 10 years, we're going to see a significant increase in the number of evening grosbeaks as the spruce budworm numbers increase, as the evening grosbeaks, that's what they feed their chicks. They need, most birds, regardless of what they eat as adults, most songbirds feed their chicks insects. And the spruce budworms are laying a buffet for evening grosbeaks. So feel free to come back to me in 10 years and tell me whether I was right or wrong.
Okay, another person wonders, robins are the last bird to sleep. They keep calling until long after sunset and start singing at 4:15 a.m. And all day they gather worms for their youngs. How do they survive with so little sleep?
Well, birds in breeding condition can seem to be, I won't say bulletproof, but there's so much going on. Like, so if you think robins are not sleeping very much, there's an American sleep researcher, avian sleep researcher named Niels Rattenberg. He's the one who realized that these birds are doing unihemispheric sleep. He was studying pectoral sandpipers up in the Arctic, and he found that a male pectoral sandpiper was defending his territory 19.5 hours a day. So he was only taking these little micro naps during the day. And not only did he not seem to suffer any ill effects, Rattenberg found that the longer a pectoral sandpiper male was awake every day, the higher his reproductive success was. So basically, the birds that slept the less were reproducing at the highest rate, which is not what you'd expect from a bird that was, dragging his tail. Migratory birds have, I suspect in many cases, biochemical defenses that we haven't quite cracked. And a lot of the things that migratory birds do, for example, migratory birds can dramatically increase their muscle mass. I mentioned bar-tailed godwits, that their guts shrink down. At the same time their guts are shrinking, their muscle mass in their breast increases 50% and their heart muscle mass increases 30 to 50%. They're doing that without exercise. Again, sign me up for that pill. we'd like to know how they protect themselves from the effects of putting on so much fat. One physiologist who studies migratory birds said, if you look at the blood chemistry of a bird that's ready to take off in its migration, it looks like the blood chemistry of an obese diabetic coronary patient. This is a bird that should be heading for the ER rather than the sky, and yet birds don't suffer any ill effects from that. Bar-tailed godwits balloon up like a sumo wrestler, shrink down like a runway model, balloon up like a sumo, and they do that over and over again for 30 years. Yo-yo dieting is dangerous to people. It will destroy your heart. It doesn't do anything to the birds. Again, there's probably biochemical defenses they have, and we'd love to find out how that works.
Thank you. What sort of changes have we seen in migration patterns due to climate change?
Oh, that's a really great question. So we've seen some changes. We've seen others that you would expect to see that we haven't seen. So, like for example, if you go back and look at long-term phenology data sets, in other words, phenology is the study of the timing in nature. So places like Mohonk House in upstate New York, where people have been keeping meticulous records of first arrival dates for birds, first emergent date for wildflowers, when trees leaf out, when amphibians start singing, and keeping that record for more than 100 years. And if you look at the arrival dates for many species of birds, they're showing up to 2 weeks earlier in the fall and leaving up to 2 weeks later 2 weeks earlier in the spring, 2 weeks later in the fall, which good on the birds, shows some flexibility. But the birds that are doing that are mostly short and moderate distance migrants. The birds like eastern towhees, eastern bluebirds, eastern phoebes, fox sparrows. These are birds that winter, within a couple hundred to most maybe 1,000 miles away. Birds that winter mostly in the southern United States. If you've got a year where you've got, one cold front after another blowing in from the north through Georgia, the fox sparrow sitting in the suburbs of Atlanta is like, I'm not going anywhere. They can tell when it's a cold late winter. On the other hand, if it's a year like this year where there was a lot of early season warmth and south winds day after day after day, they're like, I'm out of here early. So that's great for those birds. But if you're a black-throated green warbler in the forests of southern Mexico or northern Central America, you have no idea what kind of a year it is up here in the Northeast. When you look at the phenology data from places like Mohonk House, long distance migrants like warblers and vireos and tanagers, those birds are coming back on average to the day when they did a century ago. Their timing hasn't changed, and that's a problem because of course the seasons are changing. The spring is coming earlier and earlier. These birds are getting farther and farther and farther and farther out of sync with the season, and that's, I think, the thing that worries those of us who study migration the most. It's migration as a whole is going to be, at every aspect is going to be impacted by climate change, but the migrations that are going to be at most immediate and most dramatic risk are the most amazing ones, because these are birds that are already kind of living on the knife's edge of distance and resources and physiology and just what's physically possible. And if you start to perturb any of that, the whole house of cards may come tumbling down. So
Thank you, Scott.
Sorry, that was just wonderful, and what a wealth of great information. Thank you so much. I think that was our last question for the evening. I do want to just mention that I posted some links in the chat area for where you can purchase Birds and Beans coffee through DOAS, and also where they have it in store. So I think Green Earth Grocer in Oneonta does carry it. And if your local store doesn't carry it and you can't get it through DOAS, ask them to start carrying it, and make sure that you specify that it has to be the Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee. I also want to say for our EV car show, or the electric vehicle car show, Damashki Field and the Oneonta Outlaws are going to be doing the concessions there for food, and they have agreed to make bird-friendly coffee throughout the event for that. So usually when we do programs, we will serve sample pots of different blends of the Birds and Beans coffees. We haven't been able to do that in person for quite some time, but they will have a variety of different blends that they'll have available at that event. And then we will also have it there for sale. So if anybody goes and tries the coffee and really enjoys it, we've got fans that have been purchasing from our program for quite some time, and it's a program that has built up. We don't necessarily, take a profit from the program. We feel that it's important just to have it as an educational tool about the importance of preserving those habitats. So this was just such a perfect fit, and something, people always ask, what's bird-friendly coffee? So this is just beautiful, and we will be sure to share it from here out. So the EV car show is May 22nd. I think it might have been interpreted as 27, but it's May 22, Saturday in Oneonta. Scott, thank you again. We really, really enjoyed it. It was very fitting.
Susan, it was a real pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you for everything that DOAS is doing for conservation. I really appreciate it.
Yep.
So do the birds.
We work hard.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Becky. Charlie, thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.